Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks very much for joining me today. I just got back from a 10-day vacation. I went to Thailand for a friend's wedding. And so as I mentioned, I just got back. Door to door, I think I was traveling for 36 hours. So got a little bit of jet lag, but feeling pretty good right now. And I wanted to sit down and make this video for you guys because while I was in Thailand, somebody on the Discord chat requested that I make a sort of a sideboarding philosophy video or series of videos. And when he sort of explained what he meant, it made a lot of sense to me. Now, in all of my videos, I try to communicate to you guys what cards came in, what cards came out, so basic sideboarding information. But what this Merfolk pilot was looking for was something a little bit deeper, sort of a brief analysis of each matchup and just the ideas behind the sideboarding process, like what cards are the most important in the main deck, what cards are the most important in the sideboard, what cards are the most important threats in the opponent's deck that we have to prepare ourselves for. Now, hopefully, these videos will help a lot of you newer players who don't have as much experience in Modern. You know, it's a crazy broad format. And I also hope that it will help some of you more experienced players. I have a ton of experience myself and a lot of different insights into all of the different matchups. But really, what I hope comes out of these videos is some conversation down in the comments section about your guys' thoughts and insights. Because as a community, if we work together, we can really help each other and sort of strengthen the deck's position. If we're all better pilots, then the deck's obviously going to do better, right? So my goal here is to hopefully make all of us, including myself, better pilots with the deck. So speaking about being a good pilot and doing well with the deck, while I was playing over in Thailand, I just played a handful of leagues whenever I had time in the evenings. I've been doing really well. I think I had one 5-0 and then a handful of 4-1s. And I don't think on the whole 10-day trip I had to actually drop. I don't think I went X3 at all in any of the competitive leagues that I participated in. So I've been accumulating some qualifier points. Hopefully, if there's another Modern event at some point during this year, I'll be able to participate in that. You need 35 points, and I've been ticking this up pretty regularly. So I think I'll be at 35 in a couple months, hopefully. Let's say around then. Actually, really interesting recently for me, I guess, is I've been accumulating a lot of event tickets and didn't really see any large reason to just leave them sitting on the system. So I cashed out around 240 tickets, which was a little bit above what I initially paid to buy the deck. And so at this point, everything you're looking at here in my collection is gravy because my net investment is 0. And I've got about 300 tickets in profit over here, as well as another 40 potential tickets here once I trade in these chests. And the value of the deck, which again is sort of somewhere over 200 tickets, so somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 profit after the last, I think it's been about a year and a half or so. I might be underestimating that, but it feels like about a year and a half of play on Magic Online. And, you know, it hasn't been that difficult. I've had my losing streaks, and you recoup. You overall, if you are a competent, skillful pilot, you know the deck really well. It's not really hard to get to a point on Magic Online where you're not paying to play anymore. I haven't paid a single cent to play Magic on Magic Online since shortly after I bought into the deck. So hopefully a lot of you who watch these videos find that inspiring and join Magic Online if you haven't already. It's a great platform. And there's basically all the best players in the world are on here. So that's where you want to be if you're looking to become a better pilot. Recently got my rating back up over 1800, so the deck is feeling really solid. And yeah, let's go ahead and just talk about how I'm going to approach this video. So here's my deck. This is what you guys are going to be seeing a lot of, but then also I'm going to be clicking back and forth between MTG Top 8. For this video in particular, I'm going to be going through the Aggro matchups. That's how MTG Top 8 classifies the decks in the Modern format, is very loosely by aggro, control, or combo. So I'm gonna make 3 videos, and this will probably be the longest, since if we just take a quick glance, aggro is about half the format, sitting at 53%. Now these numbers are always in flux, but this is a good snapshot. So about half is aggro, a quarter is control, and about another quarter is combo. I'm gonna open up some sort of stock lists, try to find pretty stock lists for all of these aggro decks that have at least 1% metagame share. So starting with Jund, but let's first take a quick look at my my deck list and get into a little bit of the philosophy. So looking at the land, sorry, what I mean by philosophy, before I jump into the lands, is this video is going to be about philosophy, sort of theory of why we run certain quantities of cards, why we run certain cards, period, given the deck's position in the modern format. So hopefully I'm going to sort of flesh out now, in a brief way, all of the roles that the cards play in Modern, and then get into the specifics with each matchup. So 20 lands. I think right now it's split between 10 basics and 10 non-basics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The reason the split makes a lot of sense is that Ponza is really popular. That's green-red land destruction. That deck became a lot more popular when Bloodbraid Elf was unbanned. Because, well, it's a green-red deck, and that runs a lot of value 3 drops, Core Serve, Crufix, Blood Moon, things like that. And cascading into those off of Bloodbraid Elf is massive value. And also, of course, Ponza is quite strong against Jund because of its land destruction plan. And if they can keep Jund off of some of their colors, they can steal games pretty easily. So again, Ponza, very popular right now, and they tend to run 3 or 4 Blood Moons in the main deck. Now, you want to have basic lands against Blood Moon, excuse me, but you don't need that many. Really, 1 or 2 is typically going to be enough, especially if you have access to Ether Vial. Once you have Ether Vial on the table, Blood Moon becomes more or less irrelevant. Now, the reason you don't want to run only islands is since Jund and Ponza and other sort of green-red decks are popular in the format, Choke is also a real threat. Boil, less so, but it's in the format, so it's something to look out for. These are 2 cards that totally hose decks that play too many islands. So we are going to want to run things like Minamo, School at Water's Edge, and Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, just as a hedge, because we can against hoser cards like Choke and Boil. Additionally, of course, these non-basic blue sources help us keep Merfolk mirror match opponents off of Island Walk. So that's the general sort of idea behind why we run the lands that we do. You can see that on top of my 10 islands, I've got 1 Cavern of Souls and 3 Wanderine Hubs, and then the 2 legendaries and a playset of Mutavaults. The reason that I'm down to just 1 Cavern of Souls at this point is because in the sideboard over here, I'm running a playset of Deprive, which I've really been enjoying, I have to say. Our 2 mana counterspells come in against decks that have absolutely sort of critical spells to their game plan that we really want to counter. And this includes all card types, from instant spells in decks like Grishol Brand, where we want to counter Goryo's Vengeance, against Ad Nauseam, where we want to counter Ad Nauseam or Spoils of the Vault. Instant spells, obviously sorcery spells like Anger of the Gods, Planeswalkers, Liliana of the Veil. But then you've got a lot of creatures in the format that you want to counter. The one that comes to mind the most, that as far as creatures that we really, really want to have a way to deal with, is Primeval Titan against Scapeshift. Now, if you're only running Negate in your sideboard, things like Negate and Dispel and Spell Pierce, if the opponent resolves a Primeval Titan, there's really very little that Merfolk can do to win the game at that point. Dismember only gives -5/-5, and so as a 6/6, that usually doesn't do the trick against Primeval Titan. I've had it in the past where I've had a 2/2 that I can block the Titan with and then dismember it so it becomes a 1/1 and it can die to our 2/2. But often they'll have Valakut out and they can just sort of bolt our creatures with Valakut triggers, and then it's kind of impossible. So Dismember is really not good at all against Scapeshift decks. Deprive, on the other hand, is quite amazing because once you get to turn 5 or turn 6, of course, Scapeshift decks ramp a lot, so they're going to be looking to play Primeval Titan on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. As soon as they can get 6 lands, basically, you're going to want to have access to a counterspell that can stop Primeval Titan, and Deprive is one of those. Now, it's basically the original counterspell, like blue, counter target spell, with the drawback of picking up a land. Now, it is a very real drawback because we do want to hit our land drops and we want to be able to play spells on time. And it's obviously a key sort of fundamental mechanic in Magic is sort of turn 1, you have 1 land. Turn 2, you have 2 lands. Deprive sets us back on that. But our deck is one of a few that are sort of uniquely positioned such that you don't necessarily always need to have 3 or 4 lands out because you have access to Aether Vial. So with Deprive, you can counter a spell even in the earlier part of the game and still continue to develop your board with Aether Vial, helping you get creatures onto the table. Excuse me. So Deprive, I've been feeling really good with it. I've got 4 in the board right now because there are just a lot of matchups we want it against, and it's such a good catch-all spell. And I've been having a fairly good luck with it recently. All right, so we looked at the mana base. We talked about why I'm only running a single Cavern of Souls. Basically, you want to have very consistent access to double blue for Deprive. In the main deck right now, of course, we've got a lot of Merfolk. I'm not just running playsets right now, as you can see with Regery. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay. Now, the reason I've been trimming back on a couple of these Merfolk is basically Merfolk Trickster that's coming out in Dominaria. We're going to want to run as a playset. It's an extremely versatile card. Now, this video is not going to be about Merfolk Trickster, but if it's relevant, I'll try to mention it where it's going to be particularly good. But it is going to take up 4 slots in the deck, and I've been starting to try to figure out what the best configuration is going to be. Additionally, sort of on top of the fact that we're going to run 4 Tricksters, myself and Rothgar and a few of the other people on the Discord chat have been running a full playset of Spell Pierce in the main deck to pretty good success. Everybody seems pretty convinced of the strength of this card in the modern format. I've gone up and down on Spell Pierce in the past. My opinion of it went way up when I was testing blue-green Merfolk, basically from like December to February or something when Ixalan came out. And it was just consistently the best card, consistently the highest performing card in the deck. I was running like 2 Spell Pierces in blue-green Merfolk, and I just always wanted to have it in hand. Then when I went back to mono blue, I kept the 2 copies. But then when I heard Rothgar start talking about running more copies, it seemed very natural to me. I said, well, why haven't I been doing that? And so I went up to the full playset, and it's just been really good. On turn 3, we have so many 2-drops. We want to be able to play a 2-drop, and then with the extra 1 mana, if we hit our 3rd land drop, it's amazing if we can hold up Spell Pierce and counter something like a Liliana of the Veil, a Kolaghan's Command. When you counter the opponent's turn 3 spell, and you get to sort of untap on turn 4, and either play a Master of Waves or play 2 2-drops or play a Lord and activate Mutavault, we get to turn the corner really quickly. Our deck can regularly win on turn 5. In sort of rare situations, we can win on turn 4. And Spell Piercing the opponent's turn 3 play is just extremely strong. It's one of the easiest ways for us to sort of turn the corner and try to just sort of shut the door on the win. So I've been really loving Spell Pierce in the main deck as a playset. Another thing that it does is it requires us to run fewer counterspells in the sideboard and makes our counterspell matchups that much more effective against, again, combo decks like Ad Nauseam, Living End, Goryo's Vengeance. Having access already to 4 Spell Pierces in the main deck make Game 1 situations much better against those combo decks. But when we bring in 4 Deprives, 8 counter spells on top of 4 Curse Catchers, we've got access to so much counter spell effects that it just feels really strong. Modern is super broad, and there's a ton of non-creatures that we want to be able to counter, especially in the earlier part of the game. Again, Anger of the Gods, Sweltering Suns, those kinds of things. And Spell Pierce has just been doing a wonderful job for me. So, of course, taking up 4 spots in the deck, we have to trim somewhere, right? So you're not going to cut your Ether Vials. I love having 20 lands with a playset of Master of Waves, so I'm not cutting any lands. Curse Catchers are a really strong turn 1 play, especially when we're on the play, because then we can stop things like Thoughtseize in order to protect Silvergills in our hand, Spreading Seas in our hand, things that allow us to develop card advantage. If somebody Thoughtseizes us and our plan was to build up to Master of Waves, countering the Thoughtseize lets us keep Master of Waves in hand. So not cutting Curse Catchers, obviously not cutting any of the Island Walk Lords. This is a Merfolk deck, and we need our 8 Island Walk Lords. Not cutting Spreading Seas, not cutting Silvergill Adepts, not cutting Master of Waves. Now, I made a thread on Reddit, on the subreddit, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, just telling everybody that you need to be running a playset of Master of Waves right now. I got a lot of, criticism, I guess, for that post from people who run fewer than 4 Master of Waves, and it's just incorrect. You can talk about it all you want until you're blue in the face. Master of Waves is absolutely required as a playset. Not running 4 Master of Waves would be like Jund not running 4 Bloodbraid Elves. It is the biggest payoff for running a mono blue deck. We get a ton of tokens. He has protection from red. Lightning Bolt is as popular as maybe it's ever been in the format, and can't kill Master of Waves. Opponents have to do work to make Fatal Push kill Master of Waves. Now, of course, there are answers to him. Fatal Push can kill him. Collective Brutality can kill him. Liliana the Last Hope can kill him. There are answers, but there are many answers that don't. Forked Bolt, Lightning Bolt, Electrolyze, Kolaghan's Command, Terminate, Dreadbore. None of these answers that are supposed to sort of be catch-all removal spells can touch Master of Waves. And so, again, with Bloodbraid Elf being super popular, Master of Waves stonewalls Bloodbraid Elf. It can't attack in because Master of Waves can just eat the Bloodbraid Elf. If they cascade into Liliana of the Veil, it's useless because we can just sacrifice a token to her -2 effect, making a sacrifice. If they cascade into a Lightning Bolt or a Kolaghan's Command, he's safe. Jund is super popular. Again, Ponza is super popular. Just a lot of creature decks in Modern. And, Humans is like super tier 1 right now. They try to go as wide as possible. Master of Waves just goes wider than them. Of course, the Humans can go over the top in the air, but many games, they just have a bunch of stuff like Champion of the Parish, Reflector Mage, Thalia's Lieutenant, Noble Hierarchs, things like that on the ground. Master of Waves just goes right around those with a ton of tokens. Hollow One, another sort of tier 1, one of the best 1 or 2 decks in the format right now. And Master of Waves protection from red means that we can block Flameblade Adepts really easily. Means that their Flamewake Phoenixes can't play any defense against Master of Waves. Means that their Lightning Bolts again are dead. So anyhow, right now, Master of Waves, maybe the best he's ever been in the format. I could see people arguing that before Fatal Push was printed, he was even better. But he's as good as he can ever be right now in Modern. So you need to run a playset. He's super strong. He wins games. Trust me, I'm winning games with him all the time. If you're not running a playset of him, you're making a mistake. So not going to cut him. So the creatures that are on the chopping block are potentially Marrow-Regerie and Harbinger of the Tides. So looking down here, I am actually running a playset currently of Tidebinder Mage. I keep talking about how popular Jund is, how popular Ponza is, how popular Hollow One is, how popular Burn is. There's just how popular Humans is. There's so many decks right now running green and red creatures. And Tidebinder Mage has been an absolute overperformer. And so partially to get ready for creating a curve in my deck that will be identical to what I'll be running after Merfolk Trickster is released, and partially just because Tidebinder Mage is so good, I've been packing them in the main deck right now, and they've been doing a lot of work. So just sort of pretend that Tidebinder Mage for the time being is Merfolk Trickster down here at the bottom, and we can continue to sort of talk about the cuts that I've made. So if Merfolk Trickster is going to be run as a playset, and I think that it should be, for sure. I've been keeping my eyes open for situations where Merfolk Trickster would help in any given game, and it's just all the time. If we leave up 2 mana to counter, I don't know, some win condition sort of spell, and the opponent instead sort of plays a creature that could block something, we can use the 2 mana that we were holding up to counter a spell, and instead just cast Merfolk Trickster, get another body on the table, tap down their potential blocker. If the opponent plays a Tarmogoyf to protect Liliana of the Veil, at the end step we can flash in Trickster, tap down the Tarmogoyf, and attack and kill Liliana. Just so many situations where Merfolk Trickster is going to be amazing. So I definitely want to start off playing a playset of them. So then that has led me to think about cutting Harbingers and Regeries in some number. Some people have been talking about cutting all the Regeries and just sort of lowering the curve. Some people have talked about cutting all the Harbingers and keeping Regeries. And, you know, everything in between. People have been talking about making sort of a package of like 3, 3, and 3, things like that. For me, though, what seems to be the most logical, this most sort of sound approach is to run the playset of Merfolk Trickster because it's so flexible, the flash cost is so cheap, and then just run a couple of Harbingers, trimming 2 of our usual playset. Thinking about these 2 cards, Harbinger and Trickster, as sort of a package of 6 interactive Merfolk. Just because we have access to these 2 highly interactive creatures, Harbinger of the Tides and Merfolk Trickster, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to or are best served by running full playsets of each. Yes, there are tons of creatures in Modern, and we want ways to interact with them, but we also need to keep the big picture in mind. There's a whole bunch of things to consider. One very important thing is mana cost. It is a good idea to have spells at each sort of CMC level, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, skipping to 4, not having 3s is not the biggest deal. We can do the trick with Ether Vial, where when we have 2 counters, we can untap, activate Ether Vial with its trigger on the stack, put in a 2-drop, tick it up to 3, and then on our next turn, have it up to 4 counters already for Master of Waves, not ever worrying about having Ether Vial on 3 counters. But of course, having 3 drops allows us some flexibility if there is a turn where Ether Vial is sitting on 3, waiting the following turn to go up potentially to 4 for Master of Waves. We can get that Regery on the board. And so in that sense, having a 3-drop sort of helps the curve on its way up to 4 for Master of Waves. But another very important consideration regarding casting costs is the actual content of the casting cost. Harbinger, like a lot of other spells in our deck, has only blue mana symbols in its casting cost, and so what that means effectively is that Mutavaults cannot help at all in casting those spells. So Island Walk Lords, Mutavault can never help, but with Regery, he's got 2 generic mana in the casting cost, and so in certain games, you guys have certainly experienced this, you'll draw only 1 blue source and a couple of Mutavaults. And in those situations, we can get a Regery or even 2 Regeries onto the board, and then start getting some value out of tapping and untapping triggers. Say you play a Curse Catcher with the blue mana with 2 Regeries out, you can basically untap the island, float blue, untap it with the second trigger, float more blue, and then cast a 2-drop. You can tap and untap Ether Vial a bunch of times. So getting Reejerey onto the table with its easy casting cost is a very, very useful aspect of its casting cost. And it comes up. It's not meaningless. It's not you can't just disregard it and say, well, it's a 3-drop. We have tons of blue sources, and we could play a bunch of spells that cost blue, blue, blue. The fact that Reejerey doesn't cost blue, 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 but instead costs 2 and a blue, makes it much easier to cast, and that's very relevant. Beyond that, I talked already about the fact that the tapping and untapping is extremely useful. You guys all know this. It's potentially even more useful than his Lord effect. It taps down blockers. It helps us dump our hands onto the board, which can just win games by itself sometimes. So the tapping effect, the mana cost, and then of course the Lord effect. We don't want to cut, I don't think, all of the Reejereys, and just leave the Island Walk Lords as the only Lord effects, because, again, as you guys know, Lord effects are some of the sort of most potent things that we can put onto the battlefield. All of our creatures by themselves are tiny. They're 2/2s, they're 2/1s, they're 1/1s, and they need to get bigger, and we need ways to make them bigger. And Reejerey is one of those ways. So the way that my list is going to be configured once Merfolk Trickster comes out is leaving 2 Reejereys in for all the previously stated reasons, including keeping our Lord count pretty high. So instead of just the 8 Island Walk Lords, we'll maintain 10 Lord effects, including those 2 Reejereys. So I think that sort of touches on everything in the main deck. Over in the sideboard, I already talked about Deprive and how that sort of makes me want to trim Caverns back so that I regularly have access to double blue. And then beyond that, we have a bunch of spells. Pretty much everything in my sideboard is very broad. Dismember kills almost anything in the format. I mean, very few creatures don't die to Dismember. You've got Primeval Titan, as I was discussing earlier. Stuff like Elish Norn and Grishelbrand, these gigantic creatures, sort of, what is that thing? Inferno Titan. But Dismember kills everything else. It's in here specifically for matchups like Storm, where you really need to kill their cost-reduced creatures, Baral and Goblin Electromancer, against Collected Companies or Devoted Company, where you need to kill their Druid or their Vizier of Remedies so that they can't go infinite and kill us with like Walking Ballista or gigantic trampling creatures. So yeah, also just great against all the generic sort of creature decks, right? So you have it against Hollow One, you have it against Jund, have it against humans, elves. It's just sort of a catch-all creature kill spell. Not blue, so I feel like the card is a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Spell Pierce is much more at home in sort of a controlling tempo-oriented blue deck. But Dismember is something we have access to, and it does help in a good number of matchups. So I've got a couple of those in, and sort of supplementing those, I've got 2 Echoing Truths. Again, extremely broad answer. Gives us an out against garbage like Ensnaring Bridge and Worship. Can get value bouncing multiple creatures. It's great against tokens if you happen to come up against sort of Mardu Pyromancer, where they're throwing down a ton of Lingering Souls and Pyromancer Elemental tokens. So those are the creature interaction spells. Ceremonious Rejection might seem a little narrow. It can only hit colorless things, but in Modern, that's a big deal because you've got a number of different Tron decks, a number of different artifact decks, a number of different Eldrazi decks, and all of those colorless threats get answered cleanly by this sort of 1 mana counterspell. That includes Affinity. It includes Eldrazi Tron. It includes Green Tron, Red-Green Tron, colorless Eldrazi Aggro, Lantern Control, KCI, Eggs combo. any sort of Tezzerator decks. I'm getting pretty far afield now, but let's see, Eldrazi Taxes. There's just a lot of decks that Ceremonious Rejection does a great job against. And because colorless threats are sort of a very broad, I guess, high percentage of the modern format, it's definitely worth having a few of these. I currently have 3 because I've got other answers to supplement it in different matchups. If I'm playing against Krark Clan Ironworks combo with artifacts, I would probably bring in Deprives also, maybe an Echoing Truth, possibly Dismember, I guess, to deal with Scrap Trawler. But against Affinity, for example, I would bring in Dismember and Echoing Truth, but not Deprive. Against Lantern, I guess not Dismember, but all of the counter spells, Ceremonious and Deprive, and Echoing Truth. So only 3 Ceremonious, but they get backed up by other spells in different matchups. And then over here, another extremely broad answer. We've got the full playset of Relic of Progenitus. This card is an absolute house against certain decks, just wins games. Like if you come up against Living End and you happen to have a couple of relics on the board, there's really no way that they can win. They can start hard casting their like 5 and 6 drops. They're cycling creatures. But if that's their best play, then you're almost certainly winning the game. Against Dredge, it kind of just wins the game. And then it just gets tons of value against other decks, very prominent decks like Jund, right? It's 2 of its biggest threats are Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze, and both of those guys are sort of taken offline with Relic of Progenitus. Very cheap. It cycles. It draws us a card when we're done with it. I guess Goryo's Vengeance or Grishol Brand is another one that gets hosed by Relic. Any control deck that runs Snapcaster Mage, Grixis, Shadow, Relic of Progenitus comes in against. A ton of what's the word? A ton of value against a ton of decks, and so the full playset just sort of makes sense. So that's the outline of the deck. Let's go ahead and jump into the first matchup. Here we see Jund sort of sitting at the top, tied with Humans and Eldrazi Aggro with a 6% metagame share. Now, Eldrazi Aggro is sort of broad. That includes, I think, sort of Eldrazi Tron and also just sort of colorless Eldrazi, a much more aggressive deck. Let's start off with Jund, though. The decks that I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to try to look for sort of the most... Well, you can see the stars over here. The big stars are huge events. In this case, this is GP Phoenix Grand Prix from the middle of March, so not very long ago at all. Let's go ahead and open that list up. Hopefully that's sort of stock. Looking at the mana base, we see that they have a bunch of manlands. They've got 3 Raging Ravines and 2 Treetop Villages. So those are going to be excellent targets for our Spreading Seas. Any 3-color deck, especially ones that don't run blue, Spreading Seas is typically going to do a lot of work. So those are high priority targets for Spreading Seas. So of course, we're not going to sideboard out any of our Spreading Seas. They also draw cards. Jund is one of a number of decks in the format that are known as sort of attrition decks that try to gain incremental card advantage. If they can land a Dark Confidant and draw an extra card every turn, while gaining life with Scavenging Ooze, sort of offsetting the life loss from Dark Confidant. Liliana of the Veil can sort of accrue card advantage by killing our creatures sort of one by one. Kolaghan's Command can, again, generate card advantage by making us discard and killing one of our creatures. If Maelstrom Pulse kills multiple creatures, then, let's see, virtual card advantage is created with Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize by sort of picking out the most threatening card from our hand, reducing the quality of the cards that we have, while not actually reducing or creating an actual deficit in the number of cards. It creates a deficit in the quality of cards. Liliana of the Last Hope can kill our creatures by giving them -1 toughness. That's especially powerful against Master of Waves. It can just wipe away Master of Waves and all of his tokens. And then really, as far as sideboarding goes, we're going to want to think about how to approach each of these decks once they've boarded against us, right? So they're going to be bringing in more Abrupt Decays. So Kira becoming a little bit worse, although you can see that between the main and the side, this particular Jund list is only running 2 Abrupt Decays. So Kira is still a great card in the matchup. More often than not, it forces the opponent to 2-for-1 themselves. And that's kind of what we're looking for in this matchup. We want as many Silver Gills and as many Spreading Seas as we can to slow down their plan while also accruing some card advantage. Some pilots might bring in Ancient Grudge against us to deal with relics, to deal with Ether Vials, but a savvy Jund opponent will know that Merfolk sideboards out their Ether Vials, and we can just cycle any relics. So Ancient Grudge really not something they should be bringing in against us. Of course, the Anger of the Gods come in, and it's very easy playing against Jund to sort of forget about this and overextend on the table. It is a good reason to try, if you have a Lord-heavy hand, to get 3 or more Lords onto the table to sort of get our toughness past 3. If our Lords are all 4/4s, it turns off their Lightning Bolts. It turns off their Anger of the Gods. Of course, they can have something like Fatal Push or Liliana into Anger of the Gods. But yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. So Anger of the Gods are coming in. Collective Brutalities, amazing against Master of Waves. One of the few answers against Master of the Grim Lavamancer comes in. That's another reason why we want to bring in Relics in this matchup. They might bring in Kitchen Finks, help their life total, but they're not always going to be able to block since we have access to Island Walk. So depending on what they want to trim, how much they feel like they can take out, they may or may not bring in some number of Kitchen Finks. Now, Tidebinder Mage, obviously very good against Kitchen Finks, as well as most of the other creatures, if not all of them, I guess, in Jund. They'll bring in the Maelstrom Pulse. It's an answer to Master of Waves. Probably actually taking out some hand disruption. Our deck is so redundant with 8 Lords and just a bunch of 2-drops that hand disruption not as useful as it is against other sort of more combo-oriented decks where they're looking to take out a very particularly important card. Tron, again, probably not coming in against us since we have Island Walk. This is really against sort of control decks that are trying to counter all of your important threats. Tron obviously can't be countered, so this comes in against like blue-white control, but not against us. And Tireless Tracker, I don't think they're bringing that in against us. I don't think they have enough. This comes in probably against the mirror match, where the games are going to kind of go long and grindy, and you want to get value out of your land drops with something like Tireless Tracker. So that's looking at the Jund deck, and sort of jump back over to my list. We can talk about what we cut and what we bring in. So the first thing that happens is you take out all 4 Ether Vials. This may seem a little counterproductive to some of you newer players watching this video. Ether Vial is such an important part of our strategy. It helps us push out an aggressive board and sort of try to win the game quickly. And while that's true, it can be a real liability as the games go longer. A deck like Jund is packing so much removal that they're going to be able to kill most of our threats in the earlier part of the game, and the games regularly go to turns 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and beyond. And at that point, all you want to draw are Master of Waves. All you want to draw are Spreading Seas, Island Walk Lords, Silvergill Adepts, things that just give you value right away. Dismembers so that you can kill the threat that they land. Ether Vial on turn 12 off the top of the deck is absolutely game losing. It's that bad. So another reason is that if we are low on lands, we keep a low land hand with Ether Vial, then the opponent can just destroy the Ether Vial if they see that it's important with Abrupt Decay. They can destroy it with Maelstrom Pulse. They can take it out of our hand with Thoughtseize or Inquisition. They can destroy it with Kolaghan's Command. Looking at this list, they only play 1 Kolaghan's Command, but if we actually, you know what, there's a lot of resources on this website. I'm going to show you guys a cool way to look at different deck lists. So you go to Jund, and you can scroll down here and click Compare Decks, and it shows you all of the... Now this is... let me go back for a second. Each page on MTG Top 8 has 20 deck lists from recent events, people who placed in the top 8 in the last sort of few weeks. If we compare decks, all of those decks cards are listed here on the left, and the quantity and which deck in particular they're played in. So if we were interested in knowing, for example, how many Kolaghan's commands are played in the main deck of Jund, we can sort of Control F it, or just scroll down. It's all it's under other spells, and then in alphabetical order we can see 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, and then one plays 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2. So clearly the average is 2, or the mean or the mode or whatever is 2. And for that reason, we can expect Ether Vial to be that much more of a liability, because if the opponent can sort of kill an Island Walk Lord and blow up an Ether Vial with with Kolaghan's command, we're going to fall farther and farther behind in the game. So Ether Vial, philosophically, sort of fundamentally, just not what you want to be doing in games 2 and 3 against Jund. So those 4 come straight out. Very easy replacement with 4 Relic of Progenitus. Again, this card sort of neuters Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze. A lesser used mode of Kolaghan's command is return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. If the opponent has no threats and they try to grab a Tarmogoyf out, or a Scavenging Ooze, or a Bloodbraid Elf out of the graveyard, you can crack a relic and make it so that the opponent can't get that creature back. So yeah, makes their creatures worse. Turns off that mode of Kolaghan's command, and then of course, if you look at the second ability, you get to draw a card, and that's something you want to see as much as possible against Jund, where they're trying to create card value and just sort of strong arm you out of the game with sheer card advantage. Relic is a card that lets us sort of fight that axis pretty effectively. So 4 Ether Vials out, 4 Relic of Progenitus in. Other important cards that we want to bring in are basically Dismember. They don't play a lot of threats. Really, Dark Confidant, Scavenging Ooze, Tarmogoyf, those are the big ones. Bloodbraid Elf as a creature is really not a threat against us. Master of Waves stonewalls Bloodbraid because it's a red creature, and Master of Waves can just eat the Bloodbraid Elf. But really, I mean, anything trades with Bloodbraid, from a Silver Guild to a Harbinger. Even an Island Walk Lord in a pinch can easily trade with a Bloodbraid Elf, whereas Scavenging Ooze can get up to 5/5, 6/6, Tarmogoyf similar, and Dark Confidant is just so much card advantage that we really need to kill this guy in order to sort of have a better chance of not losing against Jund. So really, in this deck, just 11 creatures that we need to have an answer for, and having 2 Dismembers in the deck really helps a lot in games 2 and 3 to sort of keep their board clear of threats and allow us to sort of keep attacking in, even though it hits our life total to cast Dismember. More often than not, it saves our life total in the long run because we'll be killing sort of a big creature threat with it. In order to make space for Dismember, I typically cut Spell Pierces because well, I'm going to sort of explain why Spell Pierce isn't the best against Jund in a moment, but really we want to keep all of our creatures in, if possible, and even Curse Catchers. They don't have a ton of targets, and the games often go long, so they're not going to counter that much, but they are creatures, and they can do damage, and we need a lot of those against Jund to win the game. So to talk more about Spell Pierce against Jund, it's pretty poor for 3 reasons. Number 1, Jund has a ton of hand disruption, Thoughtseize and Inquisition, usually around 6 or 7 of these spells in their deck. If they know that we have a Spell Pierce in hand, they can easily play around it. They can play their creatures instead of their Planeswalkers, which Spell Pierce can't counter, until they get enough lands on the board, and then they can play their Liliana with 2 lands up, so that Spell Pierce is kind of irrelevant. So again, hand disruption makes Spell Pierce less relevant. If they really want to take the Spell Pierce with their hand disruption, they can do that as well. So that's reason number one, Spell Pierce is not great against Jund. They can play around it because they know that we have it because of their hand disruption. Reason number two is almost every single game goes long against Jund. And if you draw Spell Pierce in the later part of the game, the opponent's going to have 6, 7, 8 lands out. And Spell Pierce is obviously worse when the opponent has a lot of lands out. So the majority of the time we're playing against Jund, Spell Pierce is kind of dead because the opponent has too many lands. So that's reason number two. Reason number three is, as I mentioned earlier, we're taking our Ether Vials out. So Spell Pierce is really amazing with Ether Vial because you can hold up mana for Spell Pierce while still developing your board by putting creatures out with Ether Vial. When we take Ether Vial out, it becomes much, much more difficult to hold up mana to counter the opponent's important spells. For example, on turn 2, if we don't have Ether Vial out, and we play a Silvergill Adept, then the opponent on turn 3 plays a Liliana of the Veil. We don't have mana up to counter that Liliana of the Veil because we just played our 2-drop. Now, if you had Ether Vial in sort of a similar matchup that didn't have as much artifact destruction, that didn't want to go as long in each game, we could keep Ether Vial in, have it on 1 or 2 counters, and leave that mana up to counter their Planeswalker with Spell Pierce. But against Jund, no Ether Vial means we can't as effectively hold up mana. So to recap, they know about the Spell Pierce because of Thoughtseize, and that makes it worse. They have a lot of lands, so that makes it worse. And we don't play Ether Vial post-sideboard, so that makes it worse. So actually against Jund, right now, I think I trim. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I want to do with it, but I think right now, if you have good enough stuff in your sideboard, you can go ahead and trim all the Spell Pierces. So the first 2 things to get hit are Ether Vials and Spell Pierces. Relics come in, Dismembers come in, and for me, after taking out 2 Spell Pierces, I think I would take out just the third to bring in a singleton Echoing Truth. Now, Echoing Truth is a tempo card. It's actually card advantage negative because you're spending a card to not take any cards away from the opponent. You're just putting them back in their hand, which forces them to recommit mana, their resources, their time to get those creatures back onto the table. And we can't afford to lose too much card advantage in the matchup. But Echoing Truth is so versatile. It can bounce 2 of our creatures against an Anger of the Gods to save our creatures. If the opponent gets to ultimate Liliana the Last Hope, we can sort of sweep away a bunch of zombie tokens. It can bounce 2 Tarmogoyfs. So it seems good to me to take out the third Spell Pierce to bring in 1 Echoing Truth, but I don't really want both Echoing Truths in this matchup. Now, post Merfolk Trickster, I'll probably have some Tidebinders in the board. I haven't quite figured out what I want to do with Tidebinder Mage yet once Dominaria comes out. But if you have Tidebinder Mages in the sideboard, then of course absolutely bring those in because Jund is one of the main reasons I have Tidebinder Mage in my main deck right now. So that's definitely something to think about. Master of Waves, this Jund, you can see, is sort of sitting at the top of the table. It's one of the most popular decks in the format right now, one of the most powerful decks in the format right now. And Master of Waves, this is one of his best matchups. There's very little removal that can kill him, and he's just really solid against Bloodbraid Elf. So strategically, you want to be looking for hands that have a bunch of Silvergills, Spreading Seas for card advantage, anything that lets you draw a card. Post board, you're going to want to keep hands that have early Relic of Progenitus so that you can keep their Tarmogoyfs small, you can keep their Scavenging Ooze small. And then, cycle it when you need to in order to continue to develop your board well. Hit your land drops, draw into some creatures. So yeah, look for the card advantage spells, look for the graveyard trimming spells, look for Master of Waves, look for Tidebinder Mages. These are all extremely powerful cards against Jund. Now, Deprive, I could see an argument for bringing in some number of Deprives, 1 or 2 against Jund, because as a top deck, late game, Deprive is pretty solid. If the opponent and you are both just taking the card off the top of your deck, if you draw Deprive and they draw something awesome, a Tarmogoyf or Liliana, you've got a clean answer to that with Deprive. And, on turn 8 or turn 9 or whatever, you don't really mind picking up a land. At the same time, you don't want to cut creatures really, because you want to be drawing threats, even if it's something like a Curse Catcher. So for me, in this with this sideboard, I probably would take out all the Spell Pierces, bring in all the relics, 2 Dismembers, 1 Echoing Truth, and 1 Deprive, because Deprive is just going to be better in this matchup than Spell Pierce. So I think that's a pretty good outline of Jund and our approach against them. Let's go ahead and look at a humans list. This is probably going to be a pretty long video, guys. So bear with me, I guess. I'll put some timestamps for the different matchups, I guess. Grand Prix Kyoto. That's from, like the same day as that other GP I was just looking at. Sorry, I want to do a little bit more with tabs here. Looks like they placed second in Kyoto. Now, Humans is a massively popular deck right now. And it's one of the decks, maybe the only deck where Spell Pierce is virtually a dead card. They really only have Ether Vials as targets for Spell Pierce. So off the bat, the 4 Spell Pierces are just getting cut. Now, Spell Pierce is going to look pretty bad in this video since I'm showing you most of, just aggro decks in this video, like this part, but Spell Pierce really shines most against the control and combo decks. So bear that in mind as I sort of slam Spell Pierce in this video. So looking at Humans, what is their plan and what is our plan? They've got a bunch of cheap creatures. 1-drops are basically Champion of the Parish and Noble Hierarch. Now, we much prefer the Champion of the Parish openings. The humans player's sort of point of view is play the champion and then turn 2, ideally they would play 2 more champions or a Noble Hierarch and another champion so that they're immediately swinging in for 2 or 3 on turn 2 with the champion. With Exalted, with Hierarch, it could be even like swinging in for 4. The reason we prefer this opening with Champion of the Parish over Noble Hierarch is Noble Hierarch means that the opponent can potentially cast Mantis Rider on turn 2, which can be really disgusting because this thing is flying and we don't really have any defense against flying creatures. With Noble Hierarch on the board, Mantis Rider becomes a 4/4 when it's attacking with Vigilance. So, not with Vigilance, with Exalted, and of course it also has Vigilance. So a 4/4 gets a really fast clock started right on turn 2 with the Noble Hierarch opening. Now, if they open with Champion of the Parish, yeah, we'll take a few points of damage, but then we can follow up, of course, with something like a Harbinger of the Tides to bounce him back to the opponent's hand, reset the counters on the Champion of the Parish. So let's see. There are a number of green and red creatures, Mantis Rider sort of being threat number 1, so public enemy number 1 in this matchup. If you happen to have access to Tidebinder Mages, either in the side or in the main, you may actually want to consider not targeting the opponent's Noble Hierarch, even though it would slow down their development. Mantis Rider is really the card that's going to lose the game. So say turn 1, they open Hierarch, and you have a choice of playing, like a Silvergill or a Tidebinder Mage. I think that I would recommend playing the Silvergill so that, a Silvergill or a Lord, something like that. Because, yes, you could slow down their development, but then on turn 2, they'll play a second land. They'll play something like a Meddling Mage, or Thalia, a Guardian of Thraben. They can play a Kite Sail Freebooter. They have a number of 2-drops. And then on turn 3, they'll just go ahead and play the Mantis Rider. Not ahead of curve because we tap down their Noble Hierarch, but still the Mantis Rider is going to beat your face in, and you won't be able to do anything about it. So think very carefully about how you use your Tidebinder Mages in this matchup. They don't run a lot of lands, so of course they can often keep hands with maybe 2 lands and a Hierarch, and in those cases, tapping down the Hierarch is going to be amazing. If you have multiple Tidebinder Mages, then by all means, go ahead and tap down every green creature or red creature that you see. Again, we want to be looking at the sideboard because we're really concerned with games 2 and 3 in this video. So the opponent, more red creatures and green creatures in the board. The most important one that comes in against us really is it Staticaster? This is a real serious threat against Curse Catchers, Silvergills, and most important, Master of Waves. If the Is It Staticaster can get onto the board early, then it can be a real uphill battle for us. We won't be able to play out any Silvergills or Curse Catchers before we get a Lord onto the table. And if they, sort of God forbid, get a Staticaster down and then copy it with a Phantasmal Image, or simply just find their 2 Staticasters, that's pretty much lights out for us because they can kill 1 Lord each turn. They can even kill Master of Wave tokens, even if you have 2 Master of Waves, making the tokens into 3/2s. So you need to look out for these Staticasters. They are a really excellent target for Tidebinder Mage. If you can lock these guys down, then your Master of Waves will be safe. Is It Staticaster is a good target for Merfolk Trickster when that card comes out, because if you can tap the Staticaster at the end step by flashing in the Trickster, then you can vial in a Master of Waves. Staticaster won't be able to kill all the tokens, and then you'll have a big attack the next turn. So let's see. Post board, Mantis Rider is a big threat. Is It Staticaster is a big threat. Things to really look out for. So let's talk about how we want to sideboard in the humans matchup. For me, most of our sideboard is committed to non-creature threats, right? So graveyard stuff, Echoing Truth is really in there for things like Ensnaring Bridge. Deprive is mostly for for combo and control decks. We're going to bring in 2 Echoing Truths and 2 Dismembers from my sideboard, the way that it's set up, and I'm just going to cut all 4 Spell Pierces. Really easy, clear philosophy behind the sideboarding in this particular matchup. We've got a bunch of creatures. They've got only creatures, so Spell Pierce is garbage. Just bring in stuff that bounces creatures, kills creatures, take out the stuff that can't do anything about creatures. Let's see, what are our important cards in the matchup? Spreading Seas is vital because they go wide, and we need to be able to punch through with Island Walk. Master of Waves is critical because he lets us sort of match their explosive development and potentially go wider than them, in which case we often can even not need Island Walk. Spreading Seas, Master of Waves, and Harbinger is really great if we can sort of out-tempo them while sort of developing Devotion, slam a Master of Waves. That's going to be great. I guess Harbinger is sort of our equivalent of Reflector Mage. Now, Reflector Mage is a really strong reason to prioritize. I mean, we already do prioritize opening hands with Aether Vial in them, but especially important in this matchup. A similar effect is, I guess, sort of Spell Queller, things that affect our casting of creatures, right? Like if we cast a creature into Spell Queller, the opponent can sort of catch it with Spell Queller, but if we vial in the creature, then Spell Queller can't do anything about it. Similarly, if the opponent bounces our creature with Reflector Mage, it says we can't cast it again next turn, we can just vial it in. So you really want Aether Vial in this matchup. Look out for that in your opening hands. Curse Catcher, not very strong, but it's early pressure. Getting a creature on turn 1, starting to establish Devotion for Master of Waves. Island Walk Lord's clearly very important in combination with Spreading Seas. And I talked about our targets for Tidebinder Mage already. Regery, probably the least important creature in this matchup, but it is a Lord. It helps us sort of match the size of their Champions of the Parish. Thalia's Lieutenant adds a lot of counters to all their humans, and we need to not just have a bunch of 2/2s on the board. They need to get bigger. Regery helps us make them bigger. Regery and Harbinger is also one of the few ways that we can sort of get a Mantis Rider off the board. If we have a Regery, we can ideally on the opponent's attack step flash in a Harbinger, tap the Mantis Rider and bounce it. But even on our turn, on our main phase, if we don't have access to 4 mana, or we don't want to commit 4 mana to casting Harbinger with flash, then we can cast it on our main phase, tap and bounce the Mantis Rider. They're going to be able to play it out again, and it'll have haste, but they're going to have to pay 3 mana to do that. And that's just another example of sort of how we can out-tempo them by forcing them to commit large chunks of mana to redeploying the same threat again. All right, so I think that's a decent outline of the humans matchup. So let's continue. Eldrazi Aggro. I think I mentioned earlier that this is a very broad category. So I will look at a few decks. We've got Eldrazi Aggro on the top, which is a Bloodbraid Elf build. It's sort of a red-green Eldrazi deck. Then we've got some more traditional Eldrazi Tron. And there is another build that has been getting very popular lately again. It used to be more popular, I think. And this is just sort of straight up colorless Eldrazi Aggro. Now, this deck is looking to do things like exile Simian Spirit Guides on turn 1 to throw Chalice of the Void down. So it's looking for some free wins. Similarly, I guess, sort of weird, unpredictable synergies. They play Serum Powder, which allows them to mulligan and exile cards from your first hand. And if you exile Eternal Scourge, this card says you can cast it from exile. So if you have an opening hand with like 3 Eternal Scourges in it, you can take a mulligan, and those 3 Eternal Scourges sitting in exile are effectively 3 cards in your hand. So some really weird synergies, but beyond that, they just are looking to play a turn 2 Eldrazi Mimic, or even a turn 1 Eldrazi Mimic off of Eldrazi Temple, and then a turn 2 Matter Reshaper, so that the Mimic is swinging for 3, trying to land Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher, hopefully all ahead of the curve, making the Mimics really big. They run 4 Dismembers in the main with no black mana to sort of help them cast it, so they're going to be taking some life loss from that. That's helpful for us. Seagate Wreckage for card advantage. Scavenging Ground. Exile all cards from all graveyards. So this is just a colorless land that gives them some game against graveyard decks. And then they've got man lands, Blinkmoth Nexus. Spreading Sea is going to be decent here. We want to take them off of their ramp mana, Eldrazi Temple. We want to take them off their man lands. They've got some Mutavaults. We're going to need to be careful because they have Ghost Quarter. If we have a Spreading Seas on one of their lands, they can Ghost Quarter their own land to take us off of Island Walk, so be very careful if they've got a Ghost Quarter on the table. In the sideboard, they're certainly bringing in their Ratchet Bombs against us. Now, I've won on the play against a turn 2 Ratchet Bomb just by racing the Ratchet Bomb. Basically, if you can go Curse Catcher, Lord, Mutavault, Lord, and then just swing, that's sort of the textbook turn 4 win. Don't be too afraid of Ratchet Bomb. Push a lot of damage as early as you can. And if they do kill a bunch of your creatures with Ratchet Bomb, but they're at 4 life, just finish them off with Mutavault. It's don't slow down your development too much because of Ratchet Bomb, but look out for it. They're not going to bring in Relic, they're not going to bring in Spyglass, and they will bring in Spatial Contortion. So they're going to have removal at 1 mana with Dismember and at 2 mana with Spatial Contortion. So again, if you can get your creatures up to 4/4s, that's going to be good to get them outside of the range of this Colorless Bolt effect. Now, how are we sideboarding against colorless Eldrazi? Obviously, we're going to bring in all 3 Ceremonious Rejections to creature decks, so we're going to bring in Dismembers. Dismember is excellent against Thought-Knot Seer, against Reality Smasher, and really any of their creatures. Speaking of creatures, let's just make sure we have looked at all of them. This deck is not playing stuff like Endbringer. They're not playing the Basilisk Collar combo with Walking Ballista, because they're not looking to ramp to 8,000 mana like Tron. They're just looking to play a normal on curve or slightly ahead of curve set of creatures from sort of 2 mana from Eldrazi Mimic up to 5 mana for Reality Smasher. Now this guy can come out super early if they've got like Eldrazi Temple in combination with Simian Spirit Guide, potentially, on turn 3, they can have a Reality Smasher on the table. 5/5 trample, very scary. So again, back to my sideboard. Dismember is going to be great. Ceremonious Rejection is going to be great. Echoing Truth is going to be great. We want them, again, they don't have a ton of mana, just sort of enough to get their creatures out quickly. And then Deprive is actually pretty good here. It's a matchup where we certainly leave Aether Vial in. With Ratchet Bomb, they're really looking to destroy our 2-drop, so Aether Vial typically sort of flies under the radar of Ratchet Bomb. So Deprive going to be good because if we have an Aether Vial, we're not going to be too concerned with picking up lands. But it's also a little bit slow, and Eldrazi Aggro is really explosive. So those are the cards that we're going to be looking to bring in. And what cards are we going to be looking to bring out? Well, again, Spell Pierce is pretty weak because if we go and look again at their deck, they don't have a ton of stuff that we really care about countering. Chalice of the Void, we've got Aether Vial. We've got one Cavern of Souls gets around Chalice of the Void. Of course, it can be a pain in the butt if they put it on 2 and we can't cast Spreading Seas and stuff like that. But we're not going to keep Spell Pierce in specifically to deal with Chalice of the Void. We typically don't care about this card. Serum Powder, obviously, it doesn't matter. We're not looking to counter this. And we're not going to keep it in just to counter a Ratchet Bomb. They've got way too many creatures, almost as many as we do. And so Spell Pierce is an easy card to cut in this matchup. We do want to keep in the Spreading Seas. Curse Catcher also potentially easy to cut because, again, they don't have a lot of stuff that we want to counter. Also, their creatures all outclass Curse Catcher pretty neatly. Dismember and Spatial Contortion are both clean answers to Master of Waves. So we want to look to trim some number of Master Waves since at 4 mana, it's a little bit too much of an investment to risk against their removal. Like if they pay 1 mana to remove our 4-drop, they're probably doing pretty well in that game. So cutting Spell Pierces, cutting Curse Catchers, everything else is pretty great. Harbingers, we want to bounce their creatures. Actually, Tidebinder Mages, this is an example where the current build is weak against this deck, but remember, Tidebinder Mages are going to be replaced by Merfolk Trickster, which against any creature deck is going to be absolutely essential to sort of help us create favorable combat situations. And when we're not on the front foot, Trickster really helps with defense because it can tap down the biggest attacker. So really think about Tidebinder Mages as Merfolk Tricksters in this case for sort of the theory of how to sideboard against this sort of colorless Eldrazi aggro deck. So what would an actual sideboarding plan look like here? I'm going to bring in 2 Dismembers, 2 Echoing Truths, 3 Ceremonious Rejections for sure. So that's 7 cards in. And we already said we're taking 8 out. So we've got 1 Deprive to take in after that. And let's see. Now, Master Waves is still a great card. We don't want to trim too many of those. And we really don't want too many Deprives. So I'd probably bring in 2 Deprives, 3 Ceremonious, 2 Echoing Truths. That's 2, 2, 3, that's 7, 8, 9. And I'd probably just trim the 4 Curse Catchers, 4 Spell Pierce, and 1 Master of Waves. These videos that I'm going to be doing are really about sort of broad theory. There are going to be matchups where you want to have certain cards in on the play and not in on the draw. Curse Catcher is maybe the best example of this, where if you're on the draw, Curse Catcher is worse, obviously, because it can't counter the opponent's turn 1 play. If the opponent's on the play and they Thoughtseize us, we haven't had a chance to put a Curse Catcher out yet, and the Thoughtseize is going to resolve. If we're on the play, Curse Catcher protects us from that turn 1 Thoughtseize. This is not a matchup where that matters too much. Curse Catcher is useless enough in the matchup. It's basically a Merfolk with a Pearl Trident, 1 blue for a 1/1. And that's bad enough of a card. Like, we can't counter virtually anything with Curse Catcher in this matchup. So it's bad enough of a card that we really want to remove it, even though it slows down our curve, our attacks. We are, I think, the slightly slower, more controlling deck in this matchup. So a card that can counter a Reality Smasher like Deprive is going to take precedence or preference over Curse Catcher. So 4 Curse Catchers, 4 Spell Pierce, 1 Master of Waves out. I think this applies both on the play and on the draw. 3 Ceremonious, it's like the best card in this matchup. Counters anything they want to do. Prioritize hands that have blue mana and Ceremonious Rejection. Dismember, really great. But remember that against Reality Smasher, you'll have to discard a card with Dismember because when you target him with a spell, it forces you to discard another card. Harbinger, for that reason, is great because if we look at Reality Smasher, it only cares about spells whenever it becomes a target of a spell, whereas Harbinger is an ability, it's not a spell. So you can cleanly bounce Reality Smashers with Harbinger of the Tides. So Harbinger of the Tides is another card that you want to prioritize in opening hands, especially in combination with Aether Vial. If you bounce Thought-Knot Seer, you get to draw a card, and before they replay the Thought-Knot Seer to take another card out of your hand, you can potentially just sort of get the creature out onto the battlefield with Aether Vial and slow down their development while also sort of explosively developing your board. So Ceremonious Rejection is really good. Dismember is really good. Echoing Truth is okay. If you can bounce 2 things, then that's potentially game-winning, but it's really just to gain us time, to sort of slow down their aggro game and let us develop our board a little bit. And then Deprive. If the game happens to go turns 5, turn 6, Deprive is going to become really, really great because, it just counters anything. So I'm going to have a sip of water here. I think that's a good summary of the colorless aggro Eldrazi build. I'm sure some of it applies to this red-green list, but this is really about Bloodbraid Elf cascading into Eldrazi Obligator, which is a really, really gross combo because Bloodbraid Elf is a 3/2 with haste. Obligator is a 3/1 with haste. And if they have the mana, they can pay for its ability and take one of your creatures, and then your creature has haste and it's attacking. So they're going to be coming for 3, and then maybe one of your 2/2s or something like that. And even though this looks like a red card, it's not. It's devoid. So they can take your Master of Waves, and you'll lose all of your tokens. And Master of Waves does not have protection from this card. So Bloodbraid Elf cascading into Eldrazi Obligator is kind of a combo. Can also cascade into Matter Reshaper, Nest Invader, Noble Hierarch, Scavenging Ooze. The only thing it can't really cascade into is, where was it? Reality Smasher is too big, and Thought-Knot Seer is too big. But those cards obviously super good, so they are still played as playsets. Hierarch, in combination with Eldrazi Temple, is going to help them ramp into stuff like Bloodbraid Elf on turn 3. Reality Smasher and Thought-Knot Seers also. They are going to be bringing in Engineered Explosives against us, which is another great target for Ceremonious Rejection. I didn't mention that Ceremonious Rejection would also be able to counter Ratchet Bomb out of that aggro deck we just looked at. Obstinate Baloth, maybe, to gain some life against us, maybe not. Roast for sure, it's just going to come in as more removal against our Merfolk. Scavenging Ooze, probably, to gain some life. Seal of Primordium, maybe, to take us off of Island Walk, and also to destroy our Aether Vials. Pretty decent tech. So what are we looking to do against this deck? They have a Kessig Wolfrun, which is a good target for Spreading Seas. We're going to want to hit their Eldrazi temples with Spreading Seas. So rejections come in, dismembers, echoing truths again, and probably deprives. I think that this is a very similar sideboarding strategy to the aggro matchup, except here we might actually want to keep in some number of spell pierces, because between engineered explosives, ancient stirrings, and then their removal, like roast, lightning bolt, dismember, we've got a fair number of targets that we care about for spell pierce. But first, let's think about what we would want to bring in for sure. Just because of stuff like one or two scavenging oozes, we're probably not going to bring in Relic of Progenitus just for that. Definitely want to be able to kill some of their creatures, so dismembers in. Echoing Truth can slow them down. Again, it's a very fast deck. They've got tons of colorless targets, so rejection comes in, so that's definitely 7 cards in. And then pretty much from the 2 drops over, especially if you're considering Tidebinder Mages to be Merfolk Trickster, but even if you're considering them Tidebinder Mages, they're really good in this matchup because, again, if we just glance here, they have Scavenging Ooze, Noble Hierarch, Nest Invader. Remember that Obligator is not red, but they do have Bloodbraid Elf that is red. Tidebinder Mage can shut that guy down. So Tidebinder Mage really good in the matchup. Trickster, again, with any creature matchup is also very good. So yeah, all the 2 drops. Rejuries are going to want to stay in. Master of Waves. Resistant to Lightning Bolt, very important in this matchup. They do have 2 dismembers, but the other list that we looked at had, I think, 4 dismembers and 3 spatial contortions, a much more colorless removal. Roast can't touch Master of Waves, so Master of Waves definitely staying in as the full playset. It's, as I mentioned many times, very, very good against Bloodbraid Elf. So if we bring in those 7 cards, we can take out basically, I guess, just 3 Spell Pierce and 4 Curse Catcher. Or, you know what? Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Curse Catchers, again, really not going to counter anything. This is a ramp deck, so they're going to have lots of mana at their disposal. So Curse Catcher, even if there is a target for it, Ancient Stirrings or Lightning Bolt or something like that, the opponent is almost always going to be able to comfortably pay for the tax from Curse Catcher. So take out all 4 Curse Catcher, take out 3 Spell Pierce, leave in 1 Spell Pierce. Again, if you have Tidebinder Mages in the board after Merfolk Trickster comes out, bring those in. That's sort of the way that we want to approach fighting these guys. Rejury is going to be useful. It's going to help us get more value out of Harbinger of the Tides, get more value out of Merfolk Trickster, and just potentially help us grow our creatures with his Lord ability and drop our hand with his untapping ability. So one more list with Eldrazi Aggro to look at. Now, Eldrazi Aggro it makes up 6% of the metagame share, but you can see that there's these 3 very distinct decks. And this is sort of the most traditional one where they're running the Tron lands and trying to go really, really big to a turn 3 Karn. They're trying again to hit Chalice of the Void, but fortunately for us, that doesn't really do very much since we have Aether Vial and Cavern of Souls. They've got all the same creatures, the same Matter Reshaper, Reality Smasher, Thought-Knot Seer, but then they also have stuff like Endbringer and 4 Walking Ballistas. Now these are probably the creature we want to see the least in this matchup, especially in combination with Basilisk Collar. If they can get a Walking Ballista out on the board, you want to absolutely counter a Basilisk Collar if you see it, because this thing becomes, it has Death Touch, and every 1 damage that it shoots at one of our creatures, if it has Basilisk Collar on, is it going to kill the creature. So just this extremely powerful machine gun. That's a combo that's especially effective against our deck. You can see they have all its dust, and with all of their mana, it's typically not very, very difficult to cast this. Expedition maps, Karn Liberated, Mind Stones. Looking at the sideboard, they're going to bring in another Basilisk Collar. They're going to bring in Dismember. Probably not Hangerback Walker. They'll definitely bring in the Ratchet Bombs. A lot of colorless things that we can counter. They're going to bring in, let's see, probably not Warping Whales against us. So let's go ahead and talk quickly about the strategy here. Obviously, we want to cast Spreading Seas on their Tron lands, occasionally on their Eldrazi temples. You're going to want to look out for Ghost Quarter, which can take us off of Spreading Seas and Island Walk. You're going to want to look out for the Basilisk Collar combo with Endbringer, pinging our creatures, Walking Ballista, pinging our creatures. Potentially the most powerful card against us out of Eldrazi Tron is Ugin the Spirit Dragon. This list actually doesn't run it, and this is something that I'm really interested to sort of check out. If we go ahead and do that deck comparison thing here with Eldrazi Aggro, we can try to look for Ugin the Spirit Dragon. Now, it looks like out of what they categorize Eldrazi Aggro, they really don't run Ugin the Spirit Dragon, which is good for us. I guess we need to worry about Ugin more out of Green Tron or Red Green Tron, but not really Eldrazi Tron. But they do have Karn. That's a Planeswalker we want to look out for. So our strategy is, of course, leave the Spreading Seas in, leave the Spell Pierce in. There's so many targets, all the way from Expedition Map up to Karn. Let's see. Harbinger is going to be good to bounce their creatures. Curse Catcher is virtually dead. They don't run a lot of instants and sorceries, and he's just tiny. So take out the Curse Catchers. Take out the Tidebinder Mages, clearly. But if, again, you have Merfolk Trickster instead of Tidebinder, you're going to want to leave those guys in. So what are we bringing in? Or actually, Master of Waves is particularly weak in this matchup because of Endbringer and because of Walking Ballista. So Master of Waves is an easy cut. You take all 4 out. You take all 4 Curse Catchers out. That opens up 8 spots to bring better spells in. Going to bring in all 3 Ceremonious Rejections, because most of their deck is colorless. You're going to bring in, let's see, you're going to bring in some number of Deprives. You're going to bring in Dismembers, which is really brilliant against this deck because it's -5, and Reality Smasher has 5 toughness, and Endbringer has 5 toughness. Wormcoil Engine is going to be played to varying amounts in varying numbers in these different Eldrazi aggro decks. This is actually Eldrazi Tron, but Wormcoil Engine can't get hit by Dismember, but so we still want to bring it in to deal with all those creatures. If they play a Walking Ballista with like 3 counters, we'll want to get that off the table. And Echoing Truth is of sort of dubious value. If they play multiples, Echoing Truth can get some value, but potentially not really worth it. Let's see. Definitely bringing in 3 Ceremonious Rejections. Definitely bringing in 2 Dismembers. And we said we're taking out 8. So that's 3, 4, 5. And then I'd probably bring in 3 Deprives. Because we can slow down their mana with Spreading Seas. We can have a good chance to get further into the game. And Deprive can counter Wormcoil Engines as easily as sort of Ceremonious Rejection does. Counter All Is Dust. It counters anything. So Deprive is going to be great in the matchup. And we might actually want to bring in all 4. If we bring in all 4, then we're looking at bringing in 9 cards, in which case we would cut 4 Curse Catchers, 4 Master of Waves, and then who knows what the other one would be. We probably want all 4 Spell Pierce because they've got a lot of things we want to counter, especially post-board with things like Ratchet Bomb. Be quite nice to sort of counter that thing. So yeah, I don't know. You can make a sort of personal judgment call about what you think about that 4th Deprive versus the 4th Spell Pierce. You can go one way or the other. But that's the sort of outline of the matchup. We want to stop all of their big spells. Karn, Wormcoil Engine, Walking Ballista, a lot of stuff. Ceremonious Rejection is going to help. Dismember and Deprive. All right, so I think that gets us through all of the Eldrazi, so quote-unquote aggro lists. Moving on, we've got Affinity. And fortunately, there's a nice recent list that placed first in Grand Prix Kyoto that we can look at. So you guys should know this matchup. They've got a lot of man lands, 3 Blink Moth, 4 Ink Moth. I don't know if that's standard, actually, if it's not 4 and 4, usually. But at any rate, they've got a bunch of man lands, and then just a whole bunch of artifact creatures. Cranial Plating is a massive threat. They're going to be bringing in Etch Champion against us. Since we're blue, we can't really block this guy unless we have Mutavault, which is colorless. They'll probably bring in Girapor Ether Grid, which lets them really, really effectively sort of grind us out by tapping their artifacts to kill our stuff. And they're going to bring in this one Whip Flare, probably. So not a lot of sideboard hate against us. Our approach here is slow down their creatures, bounce them, counter them with Ceremonious Rejection. The cards that are bad in the matchup are Master of Waves, because it's a 4-drop, and it's such a fast matchup that we can't really guarantee that tapping out on turn 4 for Master of Waves is going to be what we want. So Master of Waves, easy card to take out. Obviously, Tidebinder Mage, very easy to take out. This is a matchup where Merfolk Trickster really, really shines, actually. This list plays 2 Master of Ethereums, and you can see that it has star. So its power and toughness are totally defined by its abilities, and Merfolk Trickster takes those abilities away and makes Master of Ethereum into a 0/0. So Merfolk Trickster, excellent in this matchup because sort of first and foremost, it kills Master of Ethereum. But beyond that, it's going to take any of their flyers, like Signal Pest, or it's not a flyer exactly, but close enough. Vault Scourge is a flyer. Also has lifelink. Merfolk Trickster, if you flash him in after Vault Scourge is declared as an attacker, this guy will lose flying, will lose lifelink, and any of your creatures can sort of just block and eat Vault Scourge. So Trickster is going to be great. Obviously, Tidebinder is going to be really, really bad. So let's see. We're going to want to cut again. Master of Waves, Tidebinder Mages, but leave Tricksters in. Spell Pierce can be decent in game 1 if you can sort of randomly counter Cranial Plating, but you want to cut it for sure because there's just not enough targets in their deck. If we look again, Galvanic Blast, Cranial Plating. Countering a Springleaf Drum doesn't really feel very good. Same thing with Mox Opal. If you've got mana up in game 1 with a Spell Pierce, of course, take the opportunity to counter something like this. Mox Opal, you can potentially slow the opponent's development down. But really, they've got as many creatures as we do, and Spell Pierce is bad in the matchup. So we can bring in, obviously, 3 Ceremonious Rejections. You want your 2 Dismembers, you want your 2 Echoing Truths. Hitting multiples is amazing in this matchup. Deprive is too slow. We really, really don't want to pick lands up. We want to be able to develop as quickly as possible. So as far as my sideboard goes, I've got those 7 cards that want to come in. And the cards that I would trim are probably just 4 Spell Pierce and 3 Master of Waves. Master of Waves, again, pretty slow. And these Tidebinders are going to be Tricksters soon. So I think Trickster is really going to improve the Merfolk matchup. Sorry, the Affinity matchup as Merfolk. But that's sort of a quick outline of our sideboarding approach. Again, I want you guys to leave comments and let me know if you have any insights above and beyond what I'm talking about. Or if you think that anything that I'm saying is wrong, of course, please let me know. Moving on, we've got Death Shadow, the most popular of which is Grixis. And I guess we might as well look at Jund Shadow as well. So mana base pretty straightforward. They've got a bunch of blue stuff, so we're going to want to cut our Spreading Seas since we're almost always going to have access to Island Walk between Watery Graves, Steam Vents, and looks like this guy's running a basic island. The way that this deck wins is by killing your creatures, Dismember, Fatal Push, Kolaghan's Command, Lightning Bolt, a lot of stuff to kill our guys. and sort of establish one or two threats of their own between a big Death Shadow, a big Gurmag, Tasigur. Street Wraiths, little misleading in the creature category. These guys virtually always get cycled to lower their life total so that Death Shadow would be bigger. Again, for you guys who worry a lot about Kolaghan's Command, decks that can run it tend to run an average of 2 across the main and the side. So it's something to look out for, but it's not something to be terrified of because decks are not packing a playset of Kolaghan's Command. So what is our approach here? Looking at their sideboard, they're going to be bringing in Collective Brutality, Engineered Explosives, Is It Staticaster, that extra Kolaghan's Command, Kolaghan's Return. Now this is a really important one to know that it exists. It's an instant speed board wipe. 2 damage to each creature for 3 mana at instant speed. Really scary, really important to keep in mind. They're going to bring in this extra Lightning Bolt. And I don't think they're bringing in Pyromancer against us. So basically a bunch of removal. Looking at our deck, let's see. Spell Pierces are excellent. This is the first sort of aggressive matchup where Spell Pierce lines up really, really well. They don't have a ton of creatures, but they do have a ton of non-creatures that Spell Pierce wants to hit. And they don't play a ton of lands. 18, actually. 2 lands less than us, 2 lands fewer, and they don't have any Ether Vial or anything like that. So they can often be stuck on 2 or 3 mana, and Spell Pierce is just sensational in this matchup. Curse Catcher, for the same reason, is excellent. We're going to cut the 4 Spreading Seas. We're going to leave Harbinger in because when the opponent does establish a threat, it often requires them to delve, like Gurmag Angler and Tasigur. And bouncing them can often make it impossible for them to recast it without getting a ton of stuff back into the graveyard. And once the game goes on a little bit longer, if we can cast Harbinger of the Tides at instant speed, it can really surprise them if they think that they're sort of they've got the win. They're going for a Temur Battle Rage, which I haven't pointed out yet, but these guys are running a singleton Temur Battle Rage. They go for the double strike, and then we can Harbinger our guy. The only sort of counter magic that they have is Stubborn Denial, and this can't counter creatures. So Harbinger, always a really nice clean answer to any of their attacking creatures. So definitely leave the Harbingers in. This is a grindy matchup, so we do want to cut Ether Vials. So you're going to cut Spreading Seas and cut Ether Vials. You're going to be looking to bring in 2 Dismembers, 2 Echoing Truths. Bounce is, even though this is a grindy matchup, bounce effects are strong because, again, they have to commit a lot of resources to cast their delve creatures, and bouncing it back to their hand can set them back quite a lot. Often, these decks can establish multiple Death Shadows, and bouncing both of them with Echoing Truth can gain you a bunch of time. And then the relics are really, really good. So you definitely want to bring in the 4 relics, the 2 Dismembers, the 2 Echoing Truths, that's 8. And that lines up well, taking out the 8 cards with 4 Ether Vials and 4 Spreading Seas. Beyond that, Tidebinder Mage, not good in this matchup, but Merfolk Trickster is really, really good. Again, they don't have a lot of threats, and the singular threats tend to be really large. Being able to tap one of those down at instant speed with Merfolk Trickster is going to be really good. Deprive is a bit of a question mark for me in this matchup, because we're taking out Ether Vials. And so we really want to develop our lands and not pick them up to cast Deprive. But at the same time, if we can counter their threats, it's going to be really good for us. So looking at our list, there's really not a lot of things that jump out as potential cuts. Master of Waves is fantastic in the matchup. They do have a bunch of red removal, and Master of Waves is resistant to that. Let's see. I could potentially see cutting like a Regery and a Curse Catcher to bring in a couple of Deprives. I think that's a solid choice. Again, though, we're taking out Ether Vials, so you want to be careful. I've brought Deprive in against Mardu Pyromancer, which is a very sort of similar type of deck, very mid-rangey. trying to grind games out, generating sort of card advantage as they go. And if you can counter like a young Pyromancer, it's incredible. So Deprive seems pretty good. But just be careful taking Aether Vial out. I think Deprive is good in these matchups. Let me know what you guys think. I think I mentioned that I would replace the last Spell Pierce with a Deprive against Jund. So I'm not sure how many we want in against Grixis Death Shadow, against Mardu Pyromancer. I'm still getting used to Deprive. It's a really strong spell, and it's possible that we should bring in all of them against these mid-range decks. So definitely let me know your thoughts on Deprive in these kinds of grindy matchups. I'm going to just check my recording software here, make sure that I'm recording. I am, and I see that this video is getting quite long. I hope you guys are still with me. Looking at Jund Shadow, the only difference really is they have Bloodbraid Elf, so Tidebinder is going to be good in this matchup. Tarmogoyf, again, Tidebinder is going to be really solid. More Kolaghan's Commands, that's the most we've seen so far. And let's see, what else? I'm not seeing, let's see. No Temur Battle Rage in this Jund list. Now, I think most Jund lists do tend to run at least a singleton Temur Battle Rage. So it's definitely something to look out for. Jund Shadow is a deck that the main difference is they don't run blue, so we're not going to be looking to take out Spreading Seas. You absolutely want to leave your Spreading Seas in. Apart from that, look out for Liliana the Last Hope, but Master of Waves is still going to be sensational. Still bringing in your relics. They're actually going to be better in this matchup because they have 4 Tarmogoyfs. Any other main differences here? Spell Pierce is still going to be solid. They've got many instants and sorceries. More after the sideboard with Anger of the Gods, Liliana of the Last Hope. So Spell Pierces stay in. Bringing in the relics, bringing in the maybe you. Let's see. I want to look at this list again. Yeah, these guys don't run those delve creatures because they don't have the blue spells to fill up their graveyard. So you don't want to bring in Echoing Truth, at least not both copies, because Echoing Truth is better against the delve creatures because it can be hard to recast them. So 4 relics, 2 dismembers, 1 Echoing Truth makes 7 cards. Let's see. I think you're going to want to trim Curse Catchers. They could potentially counter some early game stuff, but certainly Aether Vial. So that's 4, and then I think maybe 3 Curse Catchers, because Curse Catchers can't counter Planeswalkers. And you can see they run Liliana of the Veil, they run Liliana of the Last Hope, and we want to have good answers to those kinds of things. And Spell Pierce can answer those on top of being able to answer all of their instants and sorceries. You can see that they also run very few lands. This deck is on 19. And we know as Merfolk pilots that 19, 20, and 20 lands, you can often have trouble getting up to lands 3 and 4. So Spell Pierce going to be really good against these decks. So that's it for the Shadow decks. Let me know if you guys have any thoughts on my thoughts. Next up is Burn. And we have a really good matchup against Burn. Let's take a quick look at it. They are trying to send damage spells at our face. This deck has 4 Lightning Helix. I think that is atypical. Oh, is it not? Let's see. But some decks run Lightning Helix in the board in some amount, but no, it looks like they don't. Okay, so 4 Lightning Helix. I thought that it was maybe like 2 and 2 or something with the sideboard, so I'm learning something in this video. Anyhow, a whole bunch of damage spells with a bunch of hasty creatures. Let's go ahead and look at how many Lavamancers are being run if we compare the decks. Compare these decks. Look for Lavamancer. Wow, and look at that. We've got 2s across the board, a couple of 1s. This guy's not running any. So you could expect these days to see a main deck Lavamancer out of Burn, which means that a main deck Tidebinder Mage is going to be extra good. Even though Tidebinder Mage is obviously already good against things like Eidolon of the Great Revel, Goblin Guide, and Monastery Swiftspear. Out of the sideboard, they may or may not bring in Deflecting Palms. Some decks, if we go back here, they run Ensnaring Bridge. How many, actually? This guy runs a singleton. This guy runs 2, 2, 1. It's pretty rare. Since we have such a good game 1 against Burn, you can often expect to win game 1. If you see an Ensnaring Bridge in game 2, you want to bring in your Echoing Truths to get around the Ensnaring Bridge. They're probably going to bring in their Paths against us, since Master of Waves is such a beating, and Path to Exile is a good answer against that guy. And they may or may not bring in some number of Searing Bloods. They get bad if we have Lords, but again, if they have a Bolt and a Searing Blood, they can Bolt one Lord and Searing Blood the other and wreck us pretty hard. So running another deck that runs on few lands, so Spreading Seas is going to be really, really good. Let's go ahead and look at how our deck lines up. So Regery is not the strongest in this matchup because they have so many ways to deal with him, and he's a 3-drop, so a Bolt as a 1-mana answer to Regery is not that great, so we can cut this guy pretty cleanly, and then bring in anything that would be better. The way that my deck is currently set up, it's extremely strong against Burn in game 1. So 4 Spell Pierce, probably at its best against Burn because they have so many instants and sorceries. It's sort of the flip of our deck. Like, they have 30 instants and sorceries and very few creatures, and we have 30 creatures and very few instants and sorceries. So Spell Pierce, fabulous, and then obviously the 4 Tidebinder Mages are incredible. And Master of Waves just sort of ends the game if we're not, if we manage to get to the end game. Very important part of strategy against playing Burn is to trade with their creatures as often as possible. If you play a Silvergill and the opponent attacks with a Goblin Guide, absolutely block and trade with the Goblin Guide. Every bit of damage that you save gets you closer to landing Master of Waves, which just stonewalls all of their creatures, at which point you've established enough lands that you can start to hold up mana and counter all of their damage spells. And that dynamic of being able to sort of block their creatures, counter their spells, and play a Master of Waves is almost unbeatable for Burn. So there's really very little in my sideboard that I want to bring in against against Burn. I think there's actually nothing, unless they bring in an Ensnaring Bridge, in which case I would bring in Echoing Truth. But for you guys, if you're running Tidebinder Mage in the sideboard, like I'll probably be doing after Merfolk Trickster comes in, I would bring in Tidebinder Mages to replace Regery, because Lord effects in this matchup aren't super duper necessary. But locking down their creatures with Tidebinders is pretty great. So yeah, block their early creatures. Often you'll want to even chump block their creatures. Like if Swiftspear gets in and they're telegraphing that they're going to play some Burn to our face to make the Swiftspear into like a 2/3 or a 3/4. Throw your Silvergill in front of it. You're still preventing 3 damage from the prowess buffed Swiftspear. You'll lose a Silvergill at it, but again, you're gaining time. This is also really relevant against Goblins, which may or may not show up, I think, in our discussion here. If we look at the format, I don't think that Goblins actually has 1% meta share. Yeah, it's not showing up here. So against Goblins, which is a mono red deck, you're going to want to just block and trade and even throw your creatures under the bus until you get to Master Waves, and then you'll just win the game. All right, so that's Burn. Let me know if you guys have any other insights into the Burn matchup. Moving on, we have Hollow One. Sorry, I'm going to open up another tab. Now, Hollow One is a matchup that has gone, in my mind, from seeming quite difficult to seeming really favorable. And I think that the main deck Spell Pierces have a good amount to do with that. If we look at a Hollow One list. They've got so many instants and sorceries that are really central to their plan. Burning Inquiry, Faithless Looting, Goblin Lore being like the big ones. They want to discard a lot of cards so that they can cast free Hollow Ones. But if you counter things like their Burning Inquiry, where they would discard 3 cards, those Hollow Ones are going to be stranded in their hand until like turn 5 when they can actually hardcast it. Discard effects are also great for making Flameblade Adept bigger, because every time you discard a card, it gets bigger and it has menace. It's hard to block. It can deal a lot of damage. But again, if you can counter all of their draw and discard spells, then these Flameblade Adepts are going to stay really tiny. So Spell Pierce, a very, very important card in this matchup. Another deck that runs really low on lands. And it's a 2-color non-blue deck, so Spreading Seas is going to be an all-star here. A lot of graveyard stuff going on between 4 Bloodghasts, 4 Flamewake Phoenixes. They've got Gurmag Anglers that they want to cast with Delve. Tasigur they want to cast with Delve. And then they're going to be putting all the stuff into the graveyard with all of these discard spells. So if you want to bring in relics, it's a really good idea. The opponent against us is going to maybe bring in some number of Ancient Grudges to deal with Ether Vials. Potentially, if we're tapped out, they can catch us off guard by destroying a Relic of Progenitus. They may or may not bring in Big Game Hunter because our creatures don't always get to 4 power or greater. I played against a guy where he tried to destroy a 4/3 Master of Waves, and I just dismembered my own Lord in response so that the Master of Waves became a 3/2. And Big Game Hunter didn't work. So I wouldn't expect to play against Big Game Hunter, but just be aware that if they have 3 mana open, it's a possibility. Or if they have double black, I guess I should say. Engineer Explosives definitely coming in. Fatal Push is definitely coming in. Grim Lavamancer, an additional really, really good reason to bring in those Relics of Progenitus. Another really good reason to have some number of Tidebinder Mages in our 75. Going to bring in the Lightning Axe probably, and that's about it. So yeah, let's go ahead and look at our deck. We are going to definitely bring in Echoing Truths. This is one of the decks that Echoing Truth shines against. If you can bounce Hollow Ones or even Flameblade Adepts, you can often erase a lot of value that the opponent worked really hard to create. If they cast Burning Inquiries and Goblin Lores just to get the Hollow Ones onto the board, if you bounce them with Echoing Truth, they have to do that all over again. If they have Flameblade Adepts on the table and they discard a bunch of stuff to get them big, and you bounce them at instant speed, all of that potential damage is gone. So bring in both Echoing Truths for sure, bring in both Dismembers. The most important thing you want to hit with Dismember probably post-sideboard is Grim Lavamancer. But really, any threat that they present, Dismember is going to be a good answer. You want to bring in all 4 relics. So far, we've got 8 cards coming in. And we're really well set up in the main deck in this matchup. So cutting 8 cards can be pretty difficult. So let's talk about what we're going to do. Again, just understand that Tidebinder Mage is excellent in this matchup, so you do want to have as many as you can, whether they're in the main or in the side. But I'm just going to address this list right now, I guess. Spell Pierces are central, so you really don't want to trim a lot of those. Curse Catchers slow down their discard spells. So since this is a matchup where we have so many spells we want to bring in, you need to be very, very thoughtful, very conscientious about what you can do to make space. Something that I haven't mentioned yet, and I'll try to mention it more often because it's really, really important, is that when you're on the draw in any matchup, you should be cutting 1 land, because the way that the math works out, if you're on the draw, you are actually more likely to hit your land drops on time running 19 lands than you are with 20 lands on the play. The extra card draw makes a massive difference in hitting your land drops, and if 20 is enough for us to hit our land drops on the play, then 19 is more than enough to hit our land drops on the draw. So if you're on the draw, you should always basically be taking out a land. The only exceptions are where we're taking out Ether Vials also, where you may want to consider keeping in all 20 just to make extra sure that you're going to hit your land drops because we don't have Ether Vial to lean on. All right, so in this matchup, if you're on the draw, make sure that you cut a land to make space for some of the excellent cards that we can take out. Now, it can be a very explosive matchup, and even though Master of Waves is super good in the matchup because they have a lot of red stuff in their deck, we can probably trim one Master of Waves. You can trim both Regeries because he dies to Bolt and he dies to Lavamancer very easily. So that's 1, 2, 3. I think that even though Spell Pierce and Curse Catcher are really, really good, the Echoing Truth, Dismembers, and Relic of Progenitus are slightly stronger. So I think we're just trimming around the edges here. I think I cut 1 Spell Pierce. Again, having 4 in game 1 is excellent, but if we have access to stronger cards, we're going to want to make space for those stronger cards. So trim 1 Spell Pierce, 1 Curse Catcher, 2 Regeries, that's 4 cards. Master of Waves is 5 cards. Harbinger is amazing for the same reason Echoing Truth is amazing. Spreading Seas is great. Let's see. So possibly cut 2 Master of Waves. And then, you know, that's sort of the theory. In the end, whether you bring in 7 or 8 or 6 is going to depend on your sideboard. With mine in particular, I think if I have to make a decision about this, I'd probably, seeing that it's hard to make space, would leave 1 Dismember in the board, since Echoing Truth is better and they're so aggressive that Dismember can be a liability sometimes. So 2 Echoing Truth, 4 Relic, and 1 Dismember is 7 cards. Cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and maybe 1 Spreading Seas to bring in all of these excellent cards. Again, the matchup is really strong. It only gets stronger post-board. And, you know, you're even cutting cards that are sensational already in the matchup, like Master of Waves. But these cards are just a little bit better. Echoing Truth is really good against this deck. Relic is really good against this deck. And if you have to cut a couple Masters to make sure that you can play your game, even if you don't hit your 4th land, you know, sort of so be it. I think that's a good decision. All right, so that's Hollow 1. Let's go ahead to the next deck. Hate Bear is sort of like Death and Taxes, I guess. I'm not going to look at all the different variations of this, but it looks like people are tending to play this green-white version lately. A little bit, a few months ago, mono-white Death and Taxes was really popular. Let's see, I guess this is the mono-white? No, this is, I guess black and white. Black-white sort of Eldrazi Taxes is another popular one. You can see they've got Tide Hollow Sculler. Yeah, so maybe we should look at this one. As far as Hate Bears go, I think that Black-White Eldrazi Taxes is really what you're going to be seeing. They've got a bunch of stuff like Blade Splicer with Enters the Battlefield effects. Some lists will be playing Restoration Angel for sure to try to blink these guys. But the Eldrazi decks have 4 Eldrazi Displacers, so if they bounce their Blade Splicer, they're going to get extra golems out of the deal. Main deck, Gonti, Lord of Luxury, is a little bit weird. I don't think I'm going to really discuss that card here. Flicker Wisp is an important one to look out for, especially in combination with Ether Vial, so they got instant speed, bounce tricks, like if they flicker their Wasteland Strangler, then it gets to come back and kill another one of our creatures. Tide Hollow Sculler is going to exile one of our cards, and then Wasteland Strangler is just going to straight up eat that card and kill one of our creatures. So we've got this deck is almost designed to eat decks like Merfolk alive, and you have to play really, really carefully to have game against these kinds of decks. So our strategy here is to bring in Ceremonious Rejections to counter all of their Eldrazi. Potentially counter an Ether Vial. They've got a ton of colorless stuff that we can counter, and Ceremonious Rejection is great for that reason. And then you're going to bring in the creature interaction. You're going to bring in 2 Echoing Truths and 2 Dismembers. All right, Spell Pierce is terrible on the matchup because it's almost entirely creatures. They've got literally 30 creatures, 50% of their deck. So easy decision, cut the 4 Spell Pierce, cut a bunch of Curse Catchers. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Cut our counter spell effects. You're going to cut 3 Curse Catchers and 4 Spell Pierces. You're going to look to kill their threats. You're going to look to bounce their threats, and you're going to look to counter their threats with Ceremonious Rejection. So that's a pretty easy one. Let me know if you have any more thoughts. Look out for Orzhov Pontiff. This can be a massive blowout against us. They're going to bring in some fatal pushes, but not much we can do about that. At least it doesn't change our sideboarding strategy. So moving on, we've got Bogles next, which has been getting way more popular lately, and this is a very difficult deck for us to deal with, because once they get like a first strike lifelink trample guy going with hexproof, we can't bounce it with Harbinger, we can't dismember it, we really can't do a lot. The addition of 4 Spell Pierce to our deck helps this matchup a ton, because if you can counter a Daybreak Coronet or a Spirit Mantle, it can really give you enough time to develop the board and try to win. So what are we bringing in? The only creatures that they have that we can interact with are core Spirit Dancers. Now, this guy doesn't have hexproof, so we can bounce it with Harbinger, but it's not a good enough reason to keep Harbinger in the deck post-board. It's also not... we don't want to bring in Dismember to potentially answer a core Spirit Dancer. I have caught the opponent with a Dismember on a Spirit Dancer before, and it's pretty good, but it's kind of niche, so you're going to want to look for more sort of robust answers to their threats. Echoing Truth is excellent because it can bounce their enchantments, so it's really good if they put like multiples of enchantments on. The best is when they have a creature with, for example, a Hyena Umbra, and then follow up with a Daybreak Coronet, because Daybreak Coronet can only enchant a creature with another aura attached. So here, what you would look to do is bounce the Ethereal, sorry, not the Ethereal, I said Hyena Umbra, bounce the Hyena Umbra, in which case Daybreak Coronet no longer has a legal creature or a legal target, so Daybreak Coronet will just fall off and go to the graveyard. So you can really catch the opponent out in combat if they're swinging with, let's see, if they had Hyena Umbra, it would be a 2/2. +3, I guess it's a 5/5 with Vigilance, First Strike, and Lifelink. You bounce the Hyena Umbra, they lose their Totem Armor, they lose their Daybreak Coronet, and it just becomes a 1/1, and you can just eat their hexproof creature. It's a massive blowout. So Echoing Truth, really, really good. And we're going to want to bring in Deprives. It's a very difficult matchup, and even though Deprive can wreck us if we don't draw a lot of lands and we don't draw Aether Vial, it's a matchup where it's acceptable to increase some amount of variance in the deck. It's a very fast matchup, so Deprive can be bad because we won't be able to sort of get double blue in time, but you want to sort of bank on the chance that you will get double blue in time, that you will hit your land drop, so that you give yourself at least a chance to win this very difficult matchup. So 2 Echoing Truths and 4 Deprives are coming in. We are going to take out... Spreading Seas is really, really good in the matchup. It's a green-white deck, and they don't run on a lot of lands. You can hit their Horizon Canopy when it's tapped so that they won't be able to draw a card off of it. And we definitely want Island Walk in the matchup. Harbinger is bad, so we can cut that since it can't bounce anything. And if once Tidebinders here become Merfolk Trickster, it's actually going to be decent in the matchup because we can tap a core Spirit Dancer, like on upkeep. If the opponent on turn 2 plays a Spirit Dancer, and then they untap on turn 3 during their upkeep, we can tap this thing down, and they won't be able to start generating a ton of value by casting auras on it and attacking for a lot of damage. So Trickster is actually reasonably solid in the matchup. Obviously, Tidebinder Mage is just straight garbage. Master of Waves is very, very good if we can land him, because it lets us sort of just go wide and potentially deal enough damage just to sort of win the game. So if we're going to bring in 6 cards, we need to sort of cut 6 cards. If you've got 4 Harbingers, that's an easy decision. We can trim some number of Master of Waves because it's so fast, the matchup, and we might not have time to get to Master of Waves. And I'd probably cut some number of Tricksters. So in this list right now, I'll probably cut the 2 Harbingers. You know what? Curse Catchers aren't the best because they don't have a lot of instant and sorceries, just some Path to Exiles. So let's see. I probably cut 2 Curse Catchers, 2 Harbingers, and 2 Master of Waves from this list, and just replace it with 4 Deprives and 2 Echoing Truths. I would leave in all of the Tricksters just on the off chance to sort of shut down that value path that they have with Core Spirit Dancer. Okay, so that's really all we can say about Bogles. They have a couple extra Path to Exiles to bring in against us. They might bring in some number of disenchants to deal with Ether Vial. Probably not. Spirit Link comes in against us. Oh, well, maybe not. I don't know. I was thinking actually about something else. I was thinking about Spirit Mantle. Yeah, which gives it protection from creatures, I guess. So yeah, that's Bogles. Let me know if you have any thoughts to add on the matchup and the sideboarding strategy. You basically want counter spells and Echoing Truths against these guys. So what is Bant? That's pretty general. I guess they're talking about Knight of the Reliquary. Oh no, so this is Spirits, actually. Do I want to talk about Spirits? Let's see, Bant Company, Bant Spirits, Collected Bant, Bant Knightfall. I guess we'll talk really quickly about both of them. So Bant Knightfall, it's got a ton of green creatures. It's going to be great if you have Tidebinders. Merfolk Trickster is going to be really good if they try to attack with like a 6/6 Knight of the Reliquary. Flash in Trickster. If you've got a Lord on the table, it'll be a 3/3, and the Knight of the Reliquary will go back down to being a 2/2 because you take away all its abilities. So Trickster really, really good here. Tidebinder going to lock down basically everything. You're going to want to look out for Spell Quellers. In games 2 and 3, you're going to take out some number, if not all, of your Spell Pierces. It depends on if you see Collected Company. Some of these decks are more combo-oriented with Retreat to Coral Helm. Some are more value-oriented with Collected Company. Actually, you know what? Spell Pierce is decent because they've also got removal. And this deck is actually running Jaces. So a ton of green. They've got Ghost Quarter to potentially take us off of Island Walk. Gavany Township is a very good target for Spreading Seas. Let's go ahead and talk about what our strategy might be against this deck. Dismember is clearly going to be great. Relic is going to be great to take them off of Knight of the Reliquary value. If you notice, they also have Scavenging Ooze, which can be a huge threat if it gets out of control. So keep that graveyard trim. Knight of the Reliquary relies on the graveyard, so this is going to be really good for that. And if they try to get their combo going, then being able to sort of erase all of the lands in the graveyard that are making the Knight bigger is going to be a huge help. So 4 Relics in, 2 Dismembers in, probably the 2 Echoing Truths in. And then, let's see, what wants to come out here? Master's obviously very good, but it's a little bit weak to Path to Exile. Post board, they're going to have access to all 4 Path to Exiles. So since Master is a little bit weak, we probably want to cut a couple of them. Curse Catcher, not amazing because they're ramping with Knight of the Reliquary. No, that's not ramp, but with Noble Hierarch is what I meant to say. So Curse Catcher, not the best. Master of Waves, not the best because Path exists and it's a 1-mana answer to our 4-drop. Harbinger is very good. It slows him down. Tiebinder Mage is an all-star, as well as Trickster. So if we need to make space for 8 sideboard cards, I'd say you can just straight up cut all the Curse Catchers. That's 4 Curse Catchers. I would probably trim 2 Spell Pierces. That's 6, and then cut 2 Master of Waves. Again, just not a lot of non-creature spells to counter. So all of these cards become less valuable, the Pierces and the Curse Catchers. So cut 6 of those, cut 2 Masters since Path has him covered really well, and bring in 4 creature interaction spells and 4 graveyard interaction spells. So that is Bant Knightfall and our approach to it. And then Bant Spirits, Something to note about the other deck as well as this one is that they give us access to Island Walk, but it's not really reliable, especially not against Knight of the Reliquary, because they don't really need to play blue mana a lot of the time. And you want to be able to hit against Bant. Let me go ahead and open that again. Against Bant Knightfall, you want to be able to take them off of something like Gavany Township. Some of these lists run Kessig Wolf Run, and so Spreading Seas is going to be vital because they go so wide. Against Bant Spirits, I think... Sorry, this list is running 2 clicks and 2 Jaces, so you're almost, if you see a lot of islands in game 1, you can take out some number of Spreading Seas, but in a deck that doesn't have as many blue mana symbols, they can sort of sandbag their islands and just play a green-white game with Noble Hierarch and Knight of the Reliquary and Birds of Paradise. Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch can provide blue mana, so they can very easily keep us off of Island Walk. Yeah, very easily keep us off of Island Walk, in which case we do want to keep our Spreading Seas in. Against Bant Spirits, it's less likely because they need a lot more blue. They have Drogskull Captain, they have Geist, they have Mausoleum Wanderer, Phantasmal Image, Rattle Chains, Spell Queller, so Steel-Lipped Godhead. So they're going to need a lot of blue mana, so we can go ahead and take our Spreading Seas out in this matchup. We're probably not going to... if you see a bunch of birds and hierarchs, then you know you're playing against Bant and not just blue-white spirits, in which case some number of Tidebinders might be reasonable depending on what else we have to bring in. Spell Queller is going to be a real reason to look for Aether Vial in your opening hand. If you have a borderline hand without Aether Vial, then you should probably mulligan it and hopefully hit Aether Vial on your 6, because... it's so important to be able to get your creatures onto the table around Spell Queller. In game 1 especially, Spell Pierce is going to be really good against Collected Company and Path to Exile, but they do have 30 creatures, so Spell Pierce not as valuable as in many other matchups. These guys are definitely going to bring in Blessed Alliances, maybe the Khazali Pride Mages to destroy our Aether Vials. And that's really all they have against us. They might bring in the War Monk to gain life in this particular list. So looking at our deck, now we're thinking about blue-white spirits as well as this Bant list. Okay, so easy to cut the 4 Spreading Seas. We definitely want the Dismembers and Echoing Truths to be able to deal with their creatures. And that's pretty much it. If we've got, I think, 4 Spreading Seas out, 2 Echoing Truths and 2 Dismembers in, it really is sort of a creature-based matchup, but they do have some good targets for Spell Pierce. Again, Merfolk Trickster in these creature matchups is going to be really clutch. Something to note is that if the opponent takes a card from us with Spell Queller, and then we tap and kill this guy by taking away flying with Merfolk Trickster, we won't get our card back. But it might be that important to kill their flyer, so sort of keep that in mind. So what are we doing? Again, Spreading Seas not the most useful, but if this is a 3-color deck, you might want to keep in some number of Spreading Seas to be able to sort of hit their green sources. But cards that aren't super useful are Spreading Seas and Spell Pierce. I would probably keep my Spell Pierces in just because Collected Company is really important, and if we can counter a path, then we'll probably do pretty well. So yeah, cut the 4 Spreading Seas, bring in the 4 spells that interact with their creatures, and that's pretty much all I've got against this kind of a spirits deck. Let me know if you have any additional thoughts on that matchup. Moving ahead, we've got Junk, which is very, very similar to Jund, so it can save us some time. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead and click on this GP Leon list. This is from mid-February. We see that they have a lot of graveyard stuff with Grim Flayer, Scavenging Ooze, Tarmogoyf, Lingering Souls in the graveyard. So we really want to bring in our relics against junk, even more than we do against Jund. As far as other relevant things out of Jund, they run Damnation as opposed to like Anger of the Gods. So good reason to bring in some number of counter spells. Another good reason to bring in counter spells, I guess, is for these Lilianas. So looking at our deck, and if we were playing against that particular list, we would be looking to bring in the 4 relics, 2 dismembers, maybe an Echoing Truth, and some number of deprives. Now, since it's a grindy matchup, we'll probably be looking to replace Spell Pierces with deprive. We're going to take all 4 Ether Vials out, replace them with the 4 relics. Tidebinder Mage and Merfolk Trickster are both excellent in this matchup. Curse Catcher can be good to stop an early Lingering Souls, but really just it's one of the least valuable cards in the matchup. So if we want to take out 4 Ether Vials, cut the 4 Spell Pierces, and then some number of Curse Catchers to bring in 4 relics, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or let's say 4 relics, 2 dismembers, maybe 1 Echoing Truth and 2 deprives. That would be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Cut these 4, cut these 4. No, cut these 4. The vials are the first thing to get cut. Then cut the Spell Pierces, that's 8, and then 1 or 2 Curse Catchers to bring in some number of deprives. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep, that seems pretty good to me. Deprive is pretty great because it can counter, I mean, even like a Siege Rhino, if you happen to come up against Siege Rhino. This list doesn't happen to play Siege Rhino, but some of these junk lists do. You might even want to bring in more deprives against this deck because, again, Curse Catcher is not that useful. So if you cut 8, 9, 10, 11, you could bring in up to like 3 or 4 deprives in the matchup. But then let's remind ourselves that we're taking out Ether Vial, so you don't want to be overloaded with deprives because you're only casting things with spells. You're not getting anything onto the board with Ether Vial. So maybe we want to limit ourselves to 2 deprives in the matchup. So we bring in 4 relics, 2 dismembers, 1 Echoing Truth, that's 7, 8, 9. Very good. Cut 4 Ether Vials, 4 Spell Pierce, 1 Curse Catcher. We still got pretty much all our creatures, and then a bunch of nice answers to what they're bringing. All right, so that's junk. Again, very similar to Jund. Moving on, we've got the mirror. I will look at, I guess, this first list up on the top. It's just from Qualifier. Yeah, pretty similar to my list, I guess. This guy has 2 Kiras, 2 Spell Pierce instead of 4. They're going to bring in their Dismembers. They're going to bring in their Echoing Truths. You want to look out for those, but it's still not enough non-creature spells to leave in Spell Pierce. In the matchup, you want to prioritize opening hands with Ether Vial. You want to prioritize opening hands with non-basic mana sources, so you can keep the opponent off of Island Walk. We're going to bring in 2 Dismembers and 2 Echoing Truths, and we're going to take out all 4 Spell Pierces. You're going to leave in the Seas, I guess, because you can hit a Mutavault. It's one way to interact with a potential threat. But you really don't want to be stuck with useless Spell Pierces in hand. Tidebinder Mage is okay in the matchup. If you have them in the board, you can bring them in and take out your Spreading Seas, because creatures are more useful to try to win the game than Spreading Seas is. Since we're almost always going to have access to Island Walk anyway, Spreading Seas is far less useful than in other matchups. But remember that Tidebinder Mage is going to get replaced by Merfolk Trickster, which is sensational in the mirror match because, say the opponent has a Master of the Pearl Trident out, and they attack and they think they have Island Walk, all of a sudden you flash in Trickster, it targets Master of the Pearl Trident, loses its abilities, none of the creatures have Island Walk, and all of a sudden you're just trading with creatures, and of course they lose their +1/+1 also. So their creatures lose Island Walk and they get smaller, and it can just be a bloodbath. So Merfolk Trickster is going to make the mirror match way more interesting than it has been up to this point. So please let me know any other thoughts you have on the mirror match, but really the sort of axes of interaction that you want to be focusing on are maximizing tempo, so looking for Ether Vial, taking the opponent or keeping the opponent off of Island Walk. It can be particularly easy in games 2 and 3 because we often sideboard out our Spreading Seas. So if you can get a hand of Minamo, Cavern of Souls, and Mutavault, then it can be really hard for the opponent to get damage through. All right, so that is Merfolk. And continuing, we've got Zoo. It's basically green-red kind of deck, so Tidebinder Mage is going to be super excellent. Sorry, my connection is a little bit slow here, but let's go ahead and start talking about the Zoo matchup. It's a creature-based, so you're going to want to bring in Echoing Truth and Dismember, but then also Relic, since they're going to have Tarmogoyfs and Scavenging Oozes. Spells that are worse in the matchup are Spell Pierce and Curse Catcher, even though they have Paths and Lightning Bolts. They have a ton of creatures, and so Curse Catcher and Spell Pierce are just less useful. So go ahead and look at Zoo. Bloodbraid Elf, Master of Waves is going to be great. Oh, this actually has Knight of the Reliquary, so this is Big Zoo, I guess. This guy's looking to Cascade into Knight of the Reliquary, which is huge value. Also Cascade into Loxodon Smiter, Renegade Rallier. So this is a very particular type of Zoo that I actually don't think is super duper popular, but you can see the utility of Tidebinder Mage. Also, of course, Trickster tapping things down. I think much more typical that I've seen is just, Tribal Zoo is what I've seen online. So this is running Tribal Flames in a bunch of different color lands. They're going to be playing, of course, Bloodbraid Elf, but then things like Curd Ape that depend on their lands. This deck actually has Mantis Rider, so Tidebinder is at an absolute premium. Tarmogoyf may or may not be enough incentive against this deck to bring in your Relic of Progenitus. But at any rate, things that interact with creatures is going to be really important. And of course, Master of Waves is just going to have protection against any of their red creatures and their red removal. If we double check here, they're almost certainly running some burn between Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, Tribal Flames, Boros Charm. This is sort of like a hybrid burn deck almost. So Master of Waves, excellent. Harbinger is going to slow down their creatures. Now, because this particular deck has a bunch of instants and sorceries, you might want to keep some number of Spell Pierce, some number of Curse Catcher, but let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, Echoing Truths, Dismembers. It's possible, let's see, that you just want to trim your 4 Spell Pierces. Keep in your Curse Catcher to slow down those instants and sorceries. They run on very few lands. Actually, this deck has 22. I guess more than I thought because they're running Bloodbraid Elf. Previous iterations of this deck were much lower to the ground with 1-drops and 2-drops. So let's see. Curse Catcher can still slow things down. This might be a situation where you want to cut Curse Catchers on the draw, potentially bring in Relics to slow down their Tarmogoyfs, and then when you're on the play, bring the Curse Catchers back in to get that aggressive start, getting a creature down on turn 1 or turn 2 with Ether Vial, with backed up by another creature. All right, so that's Zoo. There's really not a lot to think about. It's typically a pretty good matchup because Master of Waves is such a beating, and Island Walk and Spreading Seas is so good for messing with their mana. Not only does it take them off of their colors for casting, things like Mantis Rider, let's see, what else do they have? Bloodbraid Elf, 2 colors, but it also, makes things like Curd Ape weaker, because if you can take them off of their forest, then Curd Ape is just a 1/1. If you can take them off of plains or mountains, then Wild Cattle gets weaker. So Spreading Seas is very, very good. Master of Waves is very, very good. Tidebinder Mage, very, very good. So not a very, very difficult matchup for us. And Selesnya Aggro is just kind of, I guess, another catch-all for things like Nightfall and value decks, like with Collected Company. And the axis that we're interacting with them is virtually identical. You're going to look for Tidebinder Mages for things like Loxodon Smiters. You're going to be taking out your Spell Pierces because they have very few non-creature spells. Yep, so I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our sideboarding sort of philosophy video for the aggressive decks of the format. You can see everything else is below the 1% threshold. If you guys have any questions about how to interact with tokens or how to interact with sort of life gain with Soul Sisters or Martyr of Sands, ask me in the comments. Mono green aggro, again, Harbinger of the Tides, Tidebinder Mage, all those guys are really, really good against those kinds of creature decks. So please let me know your thoughts. Please check out my Patreon page. I made this video sort of in response to a request from one of you guys, and if you appreciate that, if you value the content, please visit the Patreon page and make a pledge. And I'll see you guys in the next video, where I will be looking at the next category here, which is control decks. So I'll see you guys there. Thanks for watching. Bye.